Okay. I think we're live. I just need confirmation first on my phone before we carry on.
It says we're live on Facebook.
Okay.
Yes.
Because I made a mistake the last time. But anyway, let's get right into it. We're about a minute early, but that's okay. I mean, I think people they've been waiting for this and they're pretty ready for this. So let me first of all start off by welcoming everybody. Qhubekile Segabi, Mutape, thank you so much. Mthandazo, thank you for making the time. I know that people are busy. We might be on lockdown, but trust me, I know folks are very busy with meetings and work in between. So thank you for making this time. And I think as Millennial Dialogue, it's very important for us to really be a platform that enables the conversations between Africans. And I know that as African people, we talk a lot amongst ourselves, in our families, during dinner tables, when we're having our picnics about what is it that we should be doing as a continent, as people. For years and years, we've always had these kind of conversations. But now, for some reason, we faced with an enemy that is literally, as you've said before, offline, it's like an equalizer. This is, for a change, we're having to handle issues, that affect everybody. So we're no longer talking about inequality. We're no longer talking about unemployment and many other things. We're all worried about this COVID-19. But it's a bit tricky because you think of Africa in its context, you wonder how we're going to survive when you look at countries like the US that's really in trouble, and the UK. So I'm going to throw it in with you, Mta, and just start off by saying that we've seen that, this global pandemic has probably caused a sense of demoralization and probably hopelessness. I mean, you speak to people on the phone and you just check social media messages and people are quite, some are depressed and worried and really scared, and particularly young people. Some of them are not even taking it seriously. So we even have two sides. There's people who are really scared about this thing, but then there are those who feel like, but I really don't think this is real, and they just pretty much not caring and giving it the seriousness that it needs. Now, from your point of view, because I know you deal with a lot of communities when it comes to social justice as an activist, what has been your sense in terms of your work? What are you picking up in that regard? And how can we help these young people by creating awareness and really saying to them, look, man, this is a problem and it might affect you. How can we tackle that?
Yeah, thanks, Jabu, for facilitating and coordinating this conversation. I think it's crucial for Africans to come together into a conversation and a dialogue. And as you say, young people appear demoralized and demobilized. I think it's not new for young people. In my experience and in my most recent engagements with young people, they have always been demoralized as a result of lack of job opportunities and, of course, increasing levels of inequality, lack of access to opportunities just in society. So I think from that perspective, there is that level of being demoralized. But it doesn't mean that they are not mobilized as a sector or as a segment of society. I think young people, they are to a greater extent engaged and involved in numerous social justice initiatives and campaigns, be it in a direct response to the challenge of health crisis, to the challenge of education, as we have seen in universities and primary and secondary schooling infrastructure. Young people get mobilized for a particular cause. I think what is lacking is the broader societal understanding of how young people get mobilized and engaged. And I think in COVID-19, I think the young people, they do have a direct interest. To my understanding, I have seen, for instance, in the last number of days, people and young people in the arts and the creative sector organizing and convening online music sessions, parties, which for me I think is a direct role that young people are playing during this moment of global crisis. And of course, that goes unquantifiable in most cases, because that is a direct contribution to the psychosocial and well-being, general well-being of humanity, especially during this time. And that's a way which young people also get to mobilize society. So I think it's more of the other in the society without othering people, in understanding on how young people get involved in issues on social justice. Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, you've mentioned one of the elements of how this, of course, is an additional, almost like an addition to the problems we've had just in our society. We've been dealing with unemployment, so they have been quite demoralized for quite some time, and now they have to deal with this. Now, I really want to bring in Qhubekile in this regard and just ask about, just from an economic point of view, you know, for the first time, even I'm not an economics person, but I'm very uneasy. I'm so not okay with how things are going. And I'm thinking to myself, we have had so many issues. We struggle to feed people as a continent. I mean, any part of this continent has an issue of poverty. So are we ever going to recover from this economic stretch that the pandemic has caused or is busy perpetuating, especially for us as an emerging economy?
Yes, thank you so much, Jabulile. The good news is that we are going to recover. What we don't know is how long it will take or what that recovery will look like. I believe that after this pandemic, we are going to have a very different outlook of the world, or what the world is going to look like. So when I talk about we're not sure what the recovery is going to look like, that's because the world is going to be new after the pandemic. And also, I do expect that there will be negative economic effects as a result of the pandemic. We've seen in previous flu pandemics in the US between 1918 and 1919, they had an economic slump where they saw their manufacturing decrease by about 18% for 4 years after there was the pandemic. So I do expect that, you know, will also follow suit. African economies are most likely going to experience a recession in line with the rest of the world. So I don't think that it will be unique to us only. So everything, as you know, we are in a world that is globalized, so to speak. So globalization is the order of the day, and that means that, you know, we suffer the trickle effects of whatever happens in any economy. That's most likely going to affect us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how you say we also suffer that ripple effect that would happen globally. And Mutape, I want to bring you into this from a legal point of view, and just, I really need to understand this irony of empowerment when it comes to African leaders who, for example, I mean, there is threat to life right now, and there's probably not much stability, but going forward, how can you perhaps from a legal point of view advise African leaders to be more aware and more Africa, sort of pro-Africa, when it comes to building the continent for goodwill? So I'm specifically speaking about these projects of long-term, you know, that have long-term benefits to Africa. How can we advise or push, if needs be, our leaders to begin engaging the IMF and the World Banks and so forth to be a little bit more, you know, pro-Africa when they do these contracts? Just from a legal point of view, so that we're not so legally bound to the West sometimes as we are now, so that we can't even move on our own as a continent.
All right, thank you so much, Jabulile. From a legal point of view, first of all, we have to look at what has Africa done, what has our countries done so far in terms of engaging with the West. How have we been doing things? You'll find out there is so much reliance on your Bretton Woods institutions, your IMF and your World Bank. There are so many conditions that are set in place in order to engage these institutions. But when you look at these institutions, they were created for a purpose, and there's always been this chorus, especially with our African leaders, that we are given conditions that are either difficult to meet, we are given conditions that impoverish us, that set us into poverty. But the question really to the African leader as we go post-COVID-19, as we go into the future, is what have we done as Africans to set up our own institutions? What have we as Africans done in order to create a stable environment where business can prosper? What have we as Africans done in order to walk the talk in what we do? You will find most of the time as African leaders, we simply bash the West, that the West have done this, they've set conditions. And some of our African countries, especially in the recent times, they have turned to the East. We are now looking at China. But look at the type and the nature of contracts that our governments are entering into. They are far much worse than the conditions that are given by the Western institutions. So instead of the African leader going forward looking into institutions that have been created in other countries, we now need to have a focus on what type of institutions are we creating for ourselves. You have got your SADC, you have got your ECOWAS. They are all economic regional blocks, but they are regional blocks or economic blocks without banking institutions, regional economic blocks, without an economic swerve to them. So it's all about the institutions in which we can create as Africans going forward. What is it that we can do?
I mean, apparently we cannot, also as African countries, we really don't have that privilege or the power to even issue any sovereign guarantees without permission of like your global agencies. Now, this obviously puts the continent in a very compromised position because you cannot do much because you're tied to somebody else who essentially benefits, I suppose, from you having to pay them all the time. Now, Mtha, I really want to take a different turn and really sort of zoom into our communities and just the state of our health. I mean, we know it's not easy. As it is now, there's been, just before COVID, we were busy with the talks around NHS and just some of the issues and alternatives around health. But we do know that globally as well, the public health is a crisis. It's in crisis, but only time can tell how long, as Qhubekile might have just indicated. We're not sure how long COVID-19 will exactly last and what's the real impact that it will actually have on human life. But we know that the virus is really spreading and that for some reason we cannot really be as optimistic about the future. So when you look at Africa and just the state of our health, which is ailing, right? What do you think we can do perhaps to either stabilize or at least have some form of a progressive health system? Now that on top of the unfortunateness that we have in the health system, we have now this reality of COVID, which may last for some time.
Thanks for that, Jabu. I hope my connectivity will cooperate. But maybe I just wanted to start from where Mothupe ended in terms of for Africa being able to access loans and aid and support from the international community. I think the question for me is, can Africa afford not to access finance or aid from wherever in the world? And I think at this stage, we should be focusing and strengthening Africa's bargaining and negotiating capacity when it comes to accessing aid and loans, be it from IMF, World Bank, or from the New Development Bank, which is the BRICS-led lending institution. I think these are all options that Africa must exploit. But in doing so, it should be able to bargain and secure loans with less and aid with less of conditionalities, but also ensuring that there are various safeguards such as human rights and and the environmental safeguards. I think that's quite critical to ensure. And I think, of course, I wanted to go back to the point that you raised around the state of public infrastructure. We know that in most cases, in most countries, it has collapsed. And for that matter, coupled with corruption and lack of financing and lack of adequate and well-trained primary health or public health workers. And I think I wanted to just mention a few states. For instance, the report that was published by the Minister of Health last night. In particular, I want to highlight the statistics that is impacting on young people. We have over 628 young people infected by COVID-19. And of that, 365 are women. But if we use the expanded definition of young people or youth, we have a total of 1,396 young COVID positive young people. And again, 821 of these are women. So that points to a reality that we need to really work on tackling gender inequalities as much as we are working towards tackling and ensuring that the public health infrastructure is sufficiently equipped, well-resourced. For instance, as you know now that out of all the 121,500 tests that have been conducted by the or nationally conducted, only 33% have been done through the public health system. So 67% have been done by the private health. So that's an direct outcome of the inequalities that are found in the health system, and massive investments needs to go towards public health infrastructure. And young people do have a particular role to play. They could be harnessed, of course, and provide technological solutions. And they could be playing a role now with community and public health awareness campaigns, the screening processes. This is all the arena that could be utilized and be provided for young people to play a leading and constructive role. And of course, I think so much needs to be done in the public health infrastructure, particularly as we are now facing the COVID-19 crisis around preventative measures, but also making sure that these efforts are community-led and not institutionally led, as we have seen now, whether it's bureaucracy or the technocrats in the private sector. There must be ways and mechanisms within which communities are able to plan and respond to eventualities of disasters and crises like these ones. Yeah. So investing in public and community health and basic hygiene, I think, is quite critical. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I'm reminded of a number of trips I've made across the continent, and you really pray that you don't get ill when you're far from home. Not to say South Africa is any better, but we know even as far as our constitution is concerned, we've always been seen as a beacon of hope in some point, to say at least they're trying, to navigate the issues, because the state of health in other parts of the continent is really, not appropriate at all. And there's quite a long way for us to go in that regard. Now, could be governments on the continent have put so many strict measures to fight this coronavirus, and economies have felt the pinch. I mean, we've seen even us, where we were again divided as a community, where the local traders were being sort of given a second chance to trade. So there's conflict in terms of how exactly should we be doing this thing economically. It doesn't seem like we actually have a solid response yet. But also, you look at the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, they've also stressed that on the need to provide this debt relief to developing countries, of course, mostly in African countries. What kind of conversations do you think Africa as a continent should be having with these global powers that be, that is your IMFs and so forth? I mean, we all know that even though relations have been meant for good, sometimes Africa is sadly left indebted and to these institutions for life. What do you think should be the quality, or rather the kind of conversation we should be having with them at this stage?
Okay, I want to start off by commending the African countries which have shown seriousness in terms of fighting to curb the spread of the virus. And I mean, the results are good so far. We are seeing lower infection rates as well as lower death rates. The study that I referred to earlier was actually conducted by 3 scholars in the US, and they wanted to measure the economic impacts of the flu that I spoke to earlier as well. Interestingly, what they found is that the more stringent the restrictions on the citizens, the better the economic performance of those cities post the pandemic. So, you know, the limited social and civil interactions, you know, the social distancing, they actually did help in terms of the way that those cities performed economically afterwards. So I can just state here a few of the statistics. What they saw is a 5% relative increase in manufacturing employment after the pandemic in the cities that implemented social distancing 10 days before their counterparts. And what they also saw was that the cities that implemented social distancing for about 50 days, there was an increase of about 6.5% in their manufacturing. So I think there seems to be a correlation, according to the study, between the level of restrictions placed on the citizens versus, you know, what happens economically post the pandemic. Okay, so in terms of the type, okay, so having said that, the results of the study may not be directly applicable to Africa, of course, because I mean, the US and Africa are different structurally. And also our African economies have faced some structural, you know, issues in the past. And with the COVID-19, I think those structural issues are only going to be exacerbated. So the ways that African economies are trying to circumvent the impact of the virus, like through the financial support of small businesses, I believe that that will assist in terms of alleviating poverty and ensuring continuity of those businesses post COVID-19. And we know that small businesses are the engine of economies because they tend to employ, you know, more people on the ground, etc. So I think that you know, the sort of financial support that the government is providing or governments are providing across the continent is actually going to be beneficial. But what I want to add is that labor-intensive sectors, which cannot be productive via remote access, will feel the pinch even more than, you know, the other sectors which can actually work remotely. So your more services companies are able to work remotely, but your manufacturing sectors are not able to work remotely. So they are going to be the hardest hit, in my view, post the pandemic. One is also seeing some outliers. So I'll make an example, for example, with the private healthcare. So a lot of patients are not going to see doctors at surgeries because they're fearing that they might meet someone who's got the flu and contract it as a result. So, you know, it's actually having a trickle effect, even unintended consequences on sectors that we thought would actually survive, you know, and be stable throughout this pandemic. Now, let's get to the second part of the question that relates to what sort of conversations or the debt relief that's being offered by the IMF and the World Bank. Obviously, debt relief would be a welcomed relief. I think that, you know, external debt is funded in foreign currency. So the currencies that are used mostly are the American dollar as well as the euro. So if the IMF is coming through and saying that they want to offer debt relief to developing economies, that would mean that there's some extra funds which can be channeled towards fighting the spread of the virus as well as poverty alleviation. So the type of conversations that African economies can be having with these institutions, they can be discussing and looking at ways in which all of their debts, or maybe a certain percentage of their debts, be converted to grants, as opposed to them remaining as debts on the books of the institutions. So my proposal or my thinking around the issue or the type of discussions that should be taking place are of that nature. But those grants should not just go into the pockets of government without actually working and benefiting the economies once again. So they should be used for the benefits of the citizens during the pandemic, and also in the provision of poverty alleviation, and in support of any initiatives that can help in terms of economic growth during this time.
I mean, I don't know, it seems like it needs a very integrated effort to really make sure that Africa comes out as a winner. And this is happening just after this trade, I forget the name, the trade law that they've just passed, I think few months ago, where it is really, yes, it was really taken off, and it seems like somehow this has hampered it. But again, I really want to, Mutape, leaders, you look at what Qhubekile is saying, you put together what some of the views that are coming out of here, and at the end of it all, we're going to have to get down to the political will. A lot of people use this, I know, but not much can really happen without the will of our leaders to really have that open mind to really begin to see things in a lighter way. And I really want to just ask do you think that the legal system in our continent, in Africa, is wise enough to assist these, our leaders, manage and sign relevant contracts, healthy contracts, without really putting personal gain first at the fore? And what do we really do with this problem of dictatorship? Because it's a problem, and most of our unfortunate circumstances as a continent have, that at the heart of it is this dictatorship problem. African leaders link countries to dubious dealings, and that takes away from Africa than it actually brings in. Is there something we can do to help them legally in this regard, besides taking them to law school and really taking them through how to go about these contracts and safeguard our future as a continent?
Thanks, Jabu. Indeed, there is something we can do, legally and otherwise, politically as well. The type of contracts, the nature of contracts that African leaders are entering into are quite sad when you look at what is coming out of such contracts in terms of the benefits that are coming in back into Africa. First of all, I would point out to the nature in which we actually do things need to change. When you attend some of the summits and some of the conferences on a global stage, when you attend some of the dealings that African leaders are actually entering into, you would find out that a delegation from an African country will go to sign an agreement or an investment treaty with another country. The African delegation will be having a number of politicians on it, perhaps with just one legal advisor who is not even aware of what is really happening. And you will find out that when you're signing that contract with that with that country, they will have a large part of their delegation consisting of legal minds who really take a mirror and they look into the finer details of what they are entering into. Just this week, I was reading and discovered that Tanzania, the president of Tanzania, was canceling an agreement that they entered into with one country after he went into the fine print and discovered that the conditions that had been placed in those agreements were not favorable to Africa. So first of all, we need to invest a lot of energy in what we do, what is it that we are entering into as African countries. But also on the flip side of it, besides us really looking into the nature and the type of agreements that we are going to be entering into or that we enter into, we also need to, I will go back to the very first point I initially made, which I think Mta also touched on, which was the nature of investments or the nature of money that is coming into Africa. What can we do? Let's enter into public-private partnerships that do not only benefit the politicians or the country, but that benefits our communities. So from country level, let's get into public-private partnerships and let's cascade them so that the small businesses can also benefit in turn from the large contracts that will be coming in to benefit the country. But what we also need to do is to distinguish between two things, aid and foreign investment. Why do we need to distinguish between these two? When an investor is coming, an investor is looking at the nature or at the conditions, the circumstances that he's going to be facing. I will take the example of Zimbabwe. At some stage, we had what we call the indigenization law, wherein a local person or indigenous person was required to own 51% of a foreign company, and if the foreigners would only own 49% of the shares in that company. But when you look at the nature of how that was done, foreign companies or foreign investors did not really want now to come and invest because they were partnered with people who did not have the know-how of how to do things. Some would argue it was a good law, some would argue it was a bad law. But when you look at the gist of it, what was really transpiring is the type or the nature of business people we have in Africa at times lets us down. Let us partner with the right kind of people. Let us put in the right kind of energy in order to attract the right kind of investments. Let us not rush to sign deals, but let us look at what is it that these deals are going to bring to us and what is the long-term projections of those deals. Some of them, the future generations are going to be affected long after we are gone because of the bad deals that are being signed now. So we really need to take care of that.
Yeah, I hear you. You know, and this precisely is what I want to link to Mtha now. How do we create that awareness? Now, you spoke briefly about how we assist young people, specifically with regards to COVID-19, Mtha, but I really want us to talk about how vulnerable our communities are at this stage, and how can we sort of begin to work on helping them stand up for their rights. I know there's a lot of things happening, but we also have the sort of the emblem of human rights that we constantly need to uphold as a continent, and in some parts of the continent, we're not as good in that regard. What can we do to amplify the social justice work in this regard? Of course, you know, just topping up on what's already available as we speak.
Thanks, Jabu. I think, again, I want to start from where Mothupe ended again on the prospects that private-public partnerships could bring. But of course, there are inherent challenges there, as already alluded to, in terms of the capacity to bargain and negotiate for contracts that work for people or for public sector. So there is so much that needs to be invested in the public sector around contract negotiation. As we have seen in the most recent times, the negative role that private health providers, including your private health insurance services schemes in fixing prices, price collusion, and of course that on its own is an extended definition of political or state capture, because we do have public representatives or activists from the labor movement, from the political parties who serve in these boards, and yet fail to advance objectives and the cause that would then benefit the bigger society. And of course, I think, as we know, that South Africa, for instance, we spend 8.7% of the GDP is used on health, but outcomes are not satisfactory. 4.5% of that 8.7 is utilized and spent in private sector, which of course certainly only caters for 16% of the population, which then means 4.2% of the remaining of the GDP caters for 80% of the population. So you can see the disparities and the inequalities that are inherent in the system. But coming back to your question around people's rights, I think during this crisis, rights tend to be the last to be looked and considered at by the state in particular, And then unfortunately, sometimes when we hear the narrative about that we must serve the economy, we must serve this, sometimes I wonder if it is really and sincerely driven by the principles and the values that recognize people and their dignity, or sometimes just about just ensuring that we maximize profits. Of course, I can say profits for redistribution, but we have seen in the past that profits are not equitable, redistributed to take people out of poverty and in inequality. So I think for me, this, when we talk about post-COVID and economic recovery interventions, it must be about safeguarding and protecting and advancing human rights and dignity for all. And I think, as I've already alluded to, that it should be about human beings. For instance, we have seen the cases in Alexandra, and I can't remember where else, the excessive discharge of state power have led to a loss of life. And these are rights in crisis. So the idea that we need to ensure that there is human security for all, I think should be safeguarded. And we know that this crisis is bringing to the fore other challenges. We have seen now increases in the rate of vulnerability, but also the issue around household food insecurity. So there's starvation that is going on. We do hope that when the president and various presidents from the wider continent, as they plan and propose interventions, they directly address and protect human dignity. I think that's quite central for me. And I think if we were to hear of any economic interventions and bailouts, these must be done responsible with young people in mind. I think that's one thing that is an opportunity for Africa, is the demographic dividend. I think we should consider that investments should be targeting young people in mind, whether social protection mechanisms going to informal traders, young women in business, but it should also be about now thinking about the long-term post-COVID-19 crisis around how do we invest in research and scientific development. And these are young people who then provide these technological and scientific solutions to some of these challenges. So yes, reduction of unpaid care work and the burden that goes to young women in particular must be tackled head on. Yeah.
And it's very easy to overlook that right now, because I mean, I've heard people talk about how there's lives at risk now, rights can take a back seat for now. We don't really, but I guess that education is quite important. So we're able to really balance things that matter, because, it's in us ignoring some of the elements on human dignity that just by that very nature of doing that we become oppressive even within the mess ourselves. Qhubekile, we're gonna just wrap up, but I really would like to get your views on how Africa needs to perhaps coordinate a strong regional mechanism to consolidate small, uncompetitive firms operating in small market structures. I had mentioned this before about the free trade deal. Can it still win? Because it was more like it was on an incline just a few months ago, and it was sure that this is going to save Africa and how we do business. And maybe just wrap up for us by just giving us advice really on how, as a continent, as an African continent, we can reposition our countries when it comes to just a global chain, because we are highly dependent on imports as well, which of course right now has become a bit of a, it's stuck at this point.
Yes, Jabu, free trade will win. It will go a long way in terms of increasing economic activities between African countries. What may be an obstacle in the African continent is the fact that we are so fragmented, and also the different countries are at varied stages of their development. So that can be a bit of a problem in terms of trying to achieve that free trade area for the whole of the African continent. So what needs to be done to circumvent these obstacles is to enable free trade is that we need to stamp out uncompetitive behaviors, so eliminate monopolies, and also to standardize trade rules and regulations across the border. So you don't want to get to, if a good is moving from Egypt to South Africa, you know, as you move down the different countries, you don't want to find different regulations or different requirements for that good, you know, moving down. So you need to just standardize, we need to standardize those rules and regulations. I also wanted to mention the issue of tenders. So, tenders of above a certain threshold need to be split between big companies, medium companies, and small companies. I think this will go a long way in terms of developing small companies within the African continent. Because if a big company is going to bid for a tender, for example, of $1 billion US, there's no benefit coming through for the small business. So I think African economies need to introduce policies where they split up the value of tenders above a certain threshold. And also that will benefit small businesses, in the sense that the big companies would be required to offer mentorship of some sort to those small businesses. And also, so I think they also need to limit the number of tenders that companies can apply for. So one company cannot apply for, the same tender across different ministries, for an example, so that the smaller businesses can also have a chance and more of a level playing field, to be able to participate better within the economies.
I mean, we certainly need to really work as a continent on this dominant issue or element where one person gets a break and they just dominate forever and literally just leave everybody out. And I think this is really linked to good governance. There's absolutely, I mean, we cannot even win over COVID-19 if we're going to be having a debate about the masks that are very much needed. They're in a crisis right now. The first debate is, why should they be coming from China? The second debate is, but why can't it be done locally? And if it's done locally, then we have issues that come up of structures that have gaps, like what you've just raised. So, I mean, allow me to leave it here for now, but I really want to quickly, Mtha and Mutape, just give us a sense of what you think Africa, what unique implications do you think Africa has basically in relating to COVID-19? Just from I know you've mentioned quite a lot, Mtha, but it's global, but what unique implications would you say you've picked up on your side, whereby this is quite unique to us as a continent with this COVID-19?
Thanks, Jabu. I think, for starters, Africa is endowed with the natural resources. It must utilize its natural resources for its own benefit, develop value chains internally within Africa. As Qhubekile says, I think take advantage of the Continental Free Trade Initiative. But of course, that would mean investing in manufacturing capacities within Africa, for that matter. But I think this is an opportunity for Africa to reset, to introduce really a broad, transformative socio-economic interventions, for that matter. But of course, it should be more about how do you build an inclusive and a fairer world that works for everyone. And I think it's also high time that as we talk about public procurement and tendering systems, as much as I do not sometimes like this tendering system, I prefer state-led capacity. I think we should be able to ensure that there is meaningful participation of young people and women in public procurement processes, even if it means ensuring that there are quotas and policy and legislative processes, let that be. And I think it's high time that now we realize that without health we are nothing, and we should make a public health profession something that is likable by young people, that is fashionable, so that we save lives. Yeah, so that's my contribution. Yeah.
I mean, just to get in there quickly, I saw some, I think it's a Twitter post that said something like, you know, not all heroes wear capes. And, you know, you really think you have seen it all and that you've perhaps really understood the nature of what the nurses do and what doctors stand for and so forth. But you then face COVID-19 and you realize how important they are. And then you sort of ask young people, you know, would you be a nurse? Would you be a pharmacist? And not that they are any less, because each and every, you know, career and profession has its own dignity and importance in the world. But the truth is that there is a gap in terms of how young people do see the profession. If it's not medical doctor, anything below that is not. But you look at how, if we have aspirations as a continent of growing our health system, we might want to have those young ones sort of filtering through in that regard. Mutape, your closing remarks, what unique implications do you think we have on your side as a continent? I'm gonna unmute you. I think you muted. Okay, you can try again.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yes,
can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
All right, thank you so much. I think as a continent, we really now need to look at beneficiation of our natural resources. Instead of us having to export raw minerals out of the continent, we really need to look at how we can get into the value chain of those minerals. You would look at something like ventilators that are being made. If you go and check, most of the resources that are being used are actually coming out of Africa, and yet Africa is importing most of those things. But also we really need to look into how we can tap into the innovation that we have in one country. There is a gentleman currently who has invented a ventilator that is much more user-friendly, and that can actually be used here in Africa. But the question becomes now, on the ventilator is already there, how then can you safeguard that, properly register it, have the correct patents and everything that needs that intellectual knowledge that we do have as Africa. And perhaps one other area, we do have indigenous knowledge systems here in Africa. What are we doing about those, in terms of, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry as a whole, most of the medication that is actually being used, some of them is coming from that indigenous African knowledge that we have, but we are not benefiting from it. So what is it that Africa can do? Let's strengthen our institutions. Let's spread the knowledge that we have in terms of what is it that we can do to benefit from our own systems, to benefit from our own resources. Let's up our game and get onto the international stage where we can actually compete also, not only in terms of knowledge or collecting debts, but we need to get onto the international stage where we can also compete in terms of the benefits that come back and that can be placed into our own economies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I cannot agree with you more. I think above everything else, it probably starts with that self-confidence, self-love. I want to see an Africa that grows itself, an Africa that's certainly proud of itself, you know, and what it can produce. We certainly do have so many riches in this continent, but I wish we can multiply this kind of thinking into thousands and thousands of minds across the continent, really, so we can be able to regain our dignity and really look at our possibilities that we have. Qhubekile, please allow me to just throw in one last question in this regard of being able to, you know, have the pride for Africa. We have an issue with illicit financial flows, and I have no idea how we're going to really get around this, but as it is now, we're very stagnant in pinning down illicit financial flows as a continent. And now we have this COVID-19. What kind of investments do you think we should be thinking of? Because I know at some point we were talking about spearheading infrastructure. Is infrastructure still number one on the list now that we're looking at this kind of a future?
Illicit financial flows, Jabu, are estimated to be around 50 billion US dollars per year coming from Africa. This is obviously, causing African economies to bleed because the resources that should be used within our countries are actually, flowing out for use elsewhere. So, we have some regulations or laws that have been put into place and some acts that have been put into place in countries such as South Africa, like FICA, anti-money laundering rules and regulations to try and curb this illicit financial flow. As I said, it cuts very hard in terms of the economy, and it's a very negative impact in terms of the overall economic growth. So in terms of infrastructural development, it's still high on the list because, this free trade agreement needs to be achieved in a continent that has good infrastructure. You don't want to find that a trip that can take 2 days takes 40 days. I'm just making an example, a bit of an exaggeration, because of a lack of good infrastructure. So infrastructure can cause time delays and actually result in lower economic growth as a result because of those delays that would be in place. So that's an example of transport infrastructure. Also electricity, you need well-functioning and efficient electricity. If you're gonna have outages, that can impact on your manufacturing output, and it can cause constraints in terms of supplies. Another area then that we can focus on in terms of investments, Muthape has touched on it, it's technological innovation. I think that will be a big driver of growth going forward, in addition to your infrastructures, etc. I also believe that Africans need to be reskilled at this particular time, because as I mentioned earlier on, the world is going to look very different post COVID-19. So I'm of the view that the fourth industrial revolution is imminent in terms of the introduction of robots, unfortunately replacing human capital in the workplace. So I think that robotics needs to be compulsory at school, and if possible, software development as well, along with that, the development of apps, etc. So I think that needs to be made to be compulsory in schools. I think those are the type of investments that government could be making in their citizens to ensure that future generations are competitive in this economic landscape.
Oh yes, we certainly need to be deliberate in everything that we do. If we're not deliberate, chances are we'll achieve very little. Gents and a lady, thank you so much. Qhubekile Segabi, Muthape, thank you very much, Mthandazo. Thanks for joining us. I really do appreciate the time, and I'm sure that, as this clip perhaps begins to make rounds, we will, one step at a time, one person at a time, be able to really just plant that seed in one African at the time to perhaps really begin the mental shift, just the paradigm shift. I think we all need to begin having pride for our continent and begin to think pro-Africa in many other sort of levels, so we can together rally behind whatever it is that works for Africa. So thank you so much for the time you've given and your valuable insights. We value them, and I know everybody else will appreciate them as well. So let's stay safe and enjoy the lockdown. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Africa is imperative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Jabu.